This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Before we get into today's program, I just wanted to remind everybody that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network. So go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, religion, media, and society and how they all intersect. And you can also go to theoryofchange.show to get the full archives of this program with the video, audio, and transcript of the episodes. And if you have a paid subscriber account, you have unlimited access to all of those. And my thanks to everybody who is a paid subscriber. Thank you very much. And if you can't afford a subscription at this time, you can help out by telling your friends or family or coworkers about the show. That is also much appreciated. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into today's program. Donald Trump's rise to power within the Republican Party set off an explosion of reactionary extremism within the right-wing ecosystem. But it's important to realize that Trump did not create the present-day authoritarianism that dominates Republican politics. He only encouraged it and empowered it. As president, Trump welcomed in some of the most extreme members of Congress, including former Representatives Mick, Mulvaney, and Mark Meadows, both of whom went from throwing bombs as members of the so-called Freedom Caucus to setting policy for the entire country as the White House chief of staff. Trump's ascent to the top of Republican politics also discombobulated the lavishly funded world of right-wing media, which went from calling him a traitorous liberal who was going to sabotage the party to slavishly repeating every single one of his lies as president, including his lies about losing the 2020 presidential election. One person who saw all of this up close and personal is Terry Kreppel. He is the founder and editor of ConWebWatch, a publication that has continuously monitored and counteracted a group of right-wing websites that were started in the 1990s, including several that I personally operated during my former career as a right-wing activist. And so joining me to discuss all of this is Terry Kreppel. He is the editor of ConWebWatch, which is a website that has looked for many years at right-wing media, and he knows a lot about it. So welcome to Theory of Change, Terry.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, so as I noted in the introduction, the right-wing media ecosystem has become gigantic, so large that in many cases some of their outlets have bigger audiences than the audiences of more quote-unquote mainstream media sources like CNN, for instance, on YouTube and whatnot. But things started a lot smaller, and the extremism was always there. And that's something that you had seen in the course of doing your site, ConWebWatch. So tell us briefly just what is ConWebWatch and how long have you been doing it?
Okay, I started the website in 2000. At the time, I was working for a newspaper in Arkansas, actually the biggest one, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, as a copy editor. And I was seeing all these like websites, these right-wing websites pop up, and seeing a lot of bad journalism on these websites. And I created a website to call that out.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and well, and you, it's been interesting because I think a lot of the national journalists, including many who probably should know better, they didn't seem to pay attention to much of this stuff while it was happening. Is that right?
Yeah, they pretty much were ignoring it at the time. They didn't see it as anything major because it was still on the internet, was still a fairly small thing at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I did kind of pick up on a few of the sites that were making a larger splash on the internet at the time. Kind of focus on those.
Okay, and one of those was well, and I guess what's kind of interesting is that the sites that you had focused on for a number of years to cover and sort of respond to their statements, that they are just much less influential in the right-wing media ecosystem now than they were. It's almost like they had, been leapfrogged, and I guess, but we've I don't want to get ahead of myself here. Let's talk about the sites that you had focused on in the beginning, and what's happened to them in the interim.
Okay, the main sites I focused on at the time was WorldNet Daily, Newsmax, and the Media Research Center and its CNS news operation.
And so, WorldNet Daily, I think at this point, a lot of people have never heard of WorldNet Daily. What is it? It still exists,
Still
but it's a
barely
shadow.
exists. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, it was created by Joseph Farah back in, I think, 1998 as a outgrowth of his Western Journalism Center, which was a nonprofit to
And who
students.
was he?
What?
And who was he before he did that?
Okay, he had actually worked for newspapers, mostly in California. His He started moving steadily rightwards during that time. He eventually moved to the Sacramento Union in California, and he got a license to turn into basically a right wing newspaper,
Hmm.
and as kind of a last ditch attempt to keep the paper alive.
And it didn't work.
The paper went out of business shortly after he left, but I think he got the idea that if he could get something that probably didn't work locally, but if he could get a national audience for that kind of content, he might be able to do well. And the internet came along after that, and he was actually one of the earliest people to kind of recognize that.
To make a national news website. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, and then they continued in operation, as and I guess they were also, at least in the early days, a lot more well integrated within the Fox News, because Fox launched in, what was it, 96, I believe, right? So
Yeah.
just shortly before WorldNet Daily had.
Right.
And so what were some of the early stories that they were doing over at WorldNet Daily?
They had were heavily attacking Al Gore during the 2000 campaign, and they had actually
Hmm.
printed stories that were linked to alleged goings on in Tennessee, and they actually got some stories from a couple of people who had originally created them in the within the Center of Public Integrity, which but they eventually backed away from the stories and told them to do them on their own, and Rolling Daily picked them up.
Hmm.
And what eventually happened is they had the stories implicated a car dealer in Tennessee, portraying him as a drug dealer who had most possibly set fire to one of his car dealers as an arson for the insurance money or whatever. The car dealer eventually sued Rolla Daily for defamation,
Hmm.
and Joseph Farah made a big show about how the story is correct and the lawsuit was frivolous and all that. But a few weeks before the lawsuits to go to trial, they
Uh-huh.
quietly settled
Hmm.
and got
And did he ever comment on that fact?
nothing beyond the mutual statement in which Rolla Daly had to admit that they hadn't. There's nothing true about what they'd alleged about this guy.
Okay. And then they were also into the Vince Foster story as well, which
Oh yes, they
we'll talk
played
about
a lot of.
Newsmax with that, but yeah, what was that story for those who don't know it?
Okay, Vince Foster he was a lawyer in the Clinton White House,
Yeah.
and he had committed suicide in like 1994.
Hmm.
Even though, even though there's pretty solid evidence that it was a suicide, right wingers quickly seized on that and suggested that it was a murder, that Hillary Clinton had an affair with Vince Foster, and his this was an attempt to try to cover it up, that sort of thing.
Well, they also claimed that Chelsea Clinton was his daughter as well, if I remember right?
No, she's supposed to.
Oh, that was Webb Hubbell.
Webb
They
Hubbell,
claimed.
yes.
Man,
hard to keep all those scandal guys straight.
Yeah. Well, and I think that the Vince Foster story did kind of it illustrated that this was a type of media that was not interested in journalism and not standard fact checking and talking to everybody involved and getting their opinion that this was agenda driven
Exactly. Yes.
media that was highly opinionated and very different from anything that people might have been used to. Was that what your interest in it began from?
Yeah, I've seen how all these narratives are being pushed, even though there's no real factual basis to them. That there's promoted solely as political attacks, not as any sort of actual journalism.
Mm-hmm. And and I guess they kind of did that pretty much with a lot of different stories during the Bill Clinton presidency. And I guess there were a couple of them that there might have had a couple, like Monica Lewinsky was obviously had been involved with Bill Clinton, but that story, of course, did not originate in right wing media, notably. Well, and yeah, and I guess the other thing that was, I don't know. So I mean, at that point, as these outlets began emerging, what was what did you see the reaction being from more conventional, quote unquote mainstream media to all these things they were saying?
I think they're just basically trying to ignore it and hoping it will go away, and they really haven't. And actually, because the narrative in the right wing media is that mainstream media or liberal media or whatever term they're using these days cannot be trusted. You can only trust the right wing media that feeds on the creation of more right wing media. So it's kind of creates its own ecosystem.
Yeah, well, but also I do think though that they did feel like that they had some sort of obligation to promote these people, not just ignore them. Like they would put them on as guests sometimes to have debates about things.
Yeah.
Now, although I guess maybe they didn't do that as much back in the day, or did they?
I don't think they did as much in the early years. I don't think.
But they certainly do now.
Yeah, because it's enough of a right wing media, enough of its own thing now that pretty much has to be taken into account.
Well, though I guess there were some people who had been signed as syndicated columnists like Ann Coulter, who had who regularly interacted with, were promoted in the mainstream media, but had originated in far right media, right?
Right, and there was a lot of synergy between like Fox News and other right wing media early on because WorldNet Daily gave Bill O'Reilly a column, and that actually evolved into like a major syndicated column for several years.
And yeah, and he was. I guess it's been a little while since he was at Fox, so perhaps some people don't realize that he was the original main attraction at Fox News Channel,
right?
Back in the day.
Kind of goes
away.
And, never forget about that. You kind of forget about
that. Yeah. Well, okay, and then so WorldNet Daily also, I think, probably reached the height of its influence during the Obama years, thanks to promoting the completely unproven, undocumented claim that Barack Obama was born in Kenya or somewhere outside of the United States, and was not a citizen of the United States, aka the birther story. That was their apex, was it not?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, their original story on it was that when, like, the first story they did, like, kind of like early 2007 or 2008, where
Hmm.
they agreed that the birth certificate that Obama had presented was authentic. Then they had to backtrack and said, well, it's not a real birth certificate because it's just a copy of it. It's not the real one. So they spent the next 4 years demanding the release of the real birth certificate, which they
Hmm.
actually finally got in 2012 before
Hmm.
the 2012 campaign.
Yeah, although I guess there's still a minority of them that say, well, this is a reproduction of a, like, like a modern day this is not a
Yes, it was built in
1960s.
layers in Photoshop. Yeah, that's what Roller Daily moved to after that. It's kind of like their,
Hmm.
I think it was kind of their moral event horizon where they had to do something just to keep the story alive, and there was
Hmm.
never any evidence to show that it was,
Hmm. That it was,
manufactured.
yeah. Well, and then of course, I think that story is also significant in that it was also Donald Trump's way of entering the Republican sort of political ecosystem as
Mhm,
being somebody other than just a bloviating, serially
mhm.
bankrupt guy who owns strip clubs and casinos.
Right. And the funny thing is, in 2016, when questions were raised about Ted Cruz's birthplace and whether he was eligible to be president, uh, Roland Daly kind of backed away from birtherism because Joseph Ferris was a Cruz supporter at the time.
Yeah, he was his fellow Christian nationalist extremist.
Right.
And there's other outlets that were kind of, as you mentioned, in the trying to kind of do largely the same thing. Now, you didn't really focus on the Washington Times too much. Now, why was that?
Um, at that time, I was in Arkansas for the first few
Hmm.
years of the website, and I didn't have a lot of decent access to the Washington Times. And I figured other people were covering it better than I could.
Hmm.
Though when I
Hmm.
did move to Washington during meeting hours, I did pick up on the Washington Examiner
Hmm.
because after Philip Anschutz bought the paper back when it was just
Hmm.
a suburban daily paper.
Oh, actually, well, no, it did not exist actually under that name. It was something else. But yeah.
Yeah, it was
Uh,
originally like suburban daily. Then he changed the name to Examiner, but and
hmm.
he originally had a plan to like have Examiner publications all across the country,
Yep.
and but that never happened because the newspaper industry kind of died, basically. But for the
Yeah.
first years he owned the Washington Examiner, it was like a regular daily paper, but the editorial section moved pretty sharply right,
Hmm.
and eventually he stopped doing it as news altogether, and it become an opinion publication,
And magazine, yeah.
in a magazine, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess, Fox in many ways though was kind of, it was the place where everybody came together, where you had these radical far right publications like WorldNet Daily and Newsmax, and where they were their owners and writers were regularly interviewed and their stories were promoted. But then at the same time, they were also trying to court the more conventional Republican people like National Review or the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And so everything was kind of mashed together in Fox. And but that was not something that lasted over time. Over time, Fox became, gravitating further and further to the right. Um, Was that how much aside from Trump do you think that that was with Fox?
Um, it seems to me that no, I think the emergence of Trump kind of gave everybody a license on the right to actually move farther right and to be more farther right vocally. And Fox News certainly went that way. And
Mm-hmm. And now, what about with Cruz though? Like he was, because there was that moment in 2015, early 2016, when the more conventional Republican media and political activists did not like Trump. They were resisting him.
right,
It's interesting that they were resisting him not because they thought he was extreme right wing. In fact, they thought he was liberal. They thought he was a rhino and a centrist of some sort. That was a moment that you documented quite a bit when in looking at the different publications that you looked at.
yeah, because yeah, they didn't like Trump early on because he was more of he's doing a lot of showboating and didn't seem to have any actual
Mm-hmm.
views that he sincerely believed in. They just glommed on to whatever. And
Mm-hmm. Well,
you
and
know,
he had a past as a Democrat.
right, yeah,
And a Reform Party candidate, and hated on Pat Buchanan. They called him a Nazi, if I remember right, at one point, racist at the very least. So yeah, there were, and I guess, and he was also pro-choice for a long time as well.
mm-hmm. So saw him as somebody who didn't have any fixed views, and they were really suspicious about his moving to the right. But I think as he started to win over voters and win primaries, they kind of decided that's what they needed to do, is kind of jump on that particular horse. And
Mm-hmm. Well, what were some of the things that that you looked at in, or that you can remember that they had said about Trump, besides that he was just kind of, I mean, a lot of them really seemed to hate him. I mean, the term "never Trump," they at least I guess in the moment they meant that. Clearly, they did not mean that in afterwards, but they seem to very much loathe him. Some of them, not WorldNet Daily, of course.
right, they always kind of like Trump, and they like that he's had kind of that authoritarian feel, I guess, for lack of a better term, that had the force of personality to make his points. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even Brent Bozell at the Media Research Center, he was a big Cruz guy at first, but even he understood that momentum was shifting toward Trump, and he steered the organization to being a Trump defender.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there during that time period, there was kind of this, weird moment for the first time in its history where right wing media was actually independent of the dominant Republican politician. That had never happened
Right.
in the, let's say since the 1940s of when they really got started. Nothing like that had ever happened. When that was happening at the time, did you find that interesting? Or did you notice that to yourself?
A bit. I think I did an article on the MRC switching from hating Trump to loving Trump,
Mm-hmm.
and there was
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of animosity toward Trump at the time, but they kind
Mm-hmm.
of
Now, how much of that? Yeah, they sublimated it or stopped talking about it. But I mean, how much of that do you think though is sincere? I do. Obviously, plenty of people seem to have gone all on board and say Trump is the best thing ever, a prophet, even divinely ordained. Depending on, some people claim that. But how much of that is just simply, well, that's who our voters want, and we don't, we think he's a moron and a criminal, but we're going to go with it anyway.
Um, Probably, I think a lot of it's kind of recognizing what side their brothers voted on, and that they can't not ignore Trump, and they certainly cannot aggressively criticize him. And for the most, they usually don't. Um, though the MRC seems to be doing a backup by being a really heavy defender of Ron DeSantis.
Yeah, the Ron DeSantis, when he came along, he tried to pursue the traditional Republican strategy, which has always been from the very beginning of the Barry Goldwater organization coming along, that the way you win in the Republican Party is to say that the current rulers are too centrist, they're too liberal, they're not far enough to the right, and that you, in fact, are the real right-wing extremists and are going to take things the way they should be. And that was what Ron DeSantis tried with Donald Trump, but it didn't work at all. Why do you think that is?
Because you can't really outright Trump, because Trump was never a rhino. He was always like pretty much delivering on the right-wing goods for the most part. And there was really no space that was sufficiently to the right that he could say he could do more, but not so far right that he was come off as crazy. So like that space seems to be occupied by Vivek Ramaswamy right now. And
it's kind of hard to get further to the right of a guy who sent a mob of people to kill the Speaker of the House and the Vice President.
Right. Yeah, I mean, a rhino is pretty much the last thing you can credibly call Trump.
Yeah, and but it's the Trump's rise to dominance of the Republican Party. It not only did it kind of reorient some of the legacy right-wing media websites and media organizations, it also led to the growth and explosion of a lot of newer people who have been even more radical. And I would say, in particular, people at the Daily Wire who now, openly talk about accusing transgender people of being demonically possessed, or saying, I mean, just a variety of insane religious claims. And you got Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, who gave a speech to a far right Christian media organization in which he claimed to be having a conversation with God, and God told him he was going to be like Moses, just like Moses, and being the leader. And like that's stuff like that was not. I mean, Joe Farah, even on some of his worst days, didn't get quite up to that point. I feel like, even though he perhaps more than some of the other ones. But yeah, like the more conventional right wing media outfits, they didn't dare say anything so radical and so extreme, even though they probably did think that way.
Right. And Roller Daily does have a couple columnists who do pretty regularly attack LGBT people. Like they do have Scott Lively, who was a major anti-gay activist, and I've kind of focused lately on Michael Brown, who is a pastor whose shtick is kind of frame his hatred of gay people as compassion, and that he understands how they feel and all that. And it's like, but his words kind of betray that.
But at the same time, as these newer, much further right outlets have come into play, they've kind of really cannibalized the audience for kind of the legacy outlets that you had started tracking. I mean, is that? And I guess there's you've written about WorldNet Daily kind of falling on hard times and having to have all kinds of layoffs and things like that. You want
Right.
to talk about some of that?
Sure. Yeah, they in the past few years they've had some major issues. They lost a lot of their advertising. They'll blame Google for not for withdrawing their ad platform off the website. But a lot of it is just they keep printing fake news and conspiracy theories, and in between there, Justifier had a series of strokes that took him out of running Rolling Daily for probably over a year, and he's been kind of off and on sporadically ever since. So in between there,
Hmm.
they kind of follow the daily caller model of moving its reporting to a nonprofit and begging for donations to run that.
Hmm. Yeah, and and I guess they just, but despite all this shuffling around of stuff, it's the audience just is a shadow of what it once was.
Right.
And I guess some of that has also been they've been attacking Facebook quite a bit because they during their heyday were extremely promoted by Facebook, along with a number of other um, far right websites like the Gateway Pundit. Um, and it's interesting that they seem to act as if they're entitled to that free
Right.
promotion. That it's not the free market for Facebook to decide we don't like this website, we're not going to give it free money and
Right.
subsidize it.
They don't seem to understand that search engines like Google want credible information to be on top of their website, on the top of their search results. And Roland Daily is not. And they seem to think they're entitled to have that for some reason.
Yeah. Well, and I guess related to that, it does seem like that the more legacy right, as they have been, it seems like there are some things that they're not willing to go as far as some of these other people, and so instead they've been trying to associate with them indirectly. So they may not be promoting white nationalists on the regular, or somebody like Nick Fuentes, or somebody like Alex Jones. They may not have anything to do with them, but at the same time, they're trying to get in that on that audience by saying that someone like Jones, or various neo-Nazi people, they shouldn't be censored, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And that, like, so there's been a big push to try to claim that these views, yeah, like that there's this massive government complex to censor free thought, and of course it's always miraculously the only time they ever are concerned about it is people who are on the far right, and never anybody on the center or the left. They're
Right.
not concerned about that in any way,
Yeah.
or
They,
are they?
yeah. Well, the first problems that Roland Daily started having with Google was when it started publishing a guy named Colin Flaherty, who was very much into race baiting. It's not really explicit racism, but it's more you know making people afraid of black people and how any crime is done by black mobs and
Hmm.
and
Well, but World Net Daily is not the only one that's been doing this.
right.
What is the verbiage that they're using, and I mean, what, like, if you can talk about that a little bit?
I mean, they just kind of do it as kind of innocuously as possible, kind of focusing on black on white crime. It's kind of like the main focus of these writers, and kind of hyping that. Though it's innocuous at the top, but it's clearly a racist motive kind of at the bottom. And
Hmm.
another writer who's moving that way is like well-known columnist named Jack Cashel, who just wrote a book that effectively tries to absolve white people of guilt for fleeing cities in the 1960s, and you know, out of alleged fear of crime by minorities, I guess. It's
Mm-hmm.
just so much so that VDARE endorsed the book.
And VDR is what, for those who don't know?
Yeah, it's very white nationalist. Um, to the point,
Anti-immigrant. Yeah.
yes, and if you understand the reference, as named after Virginia Dare, who was the first white person who was born in the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, there's just this. I don't know. I mean, this continual dynamic, though, of that the Republican Party must always continue moving rightward. That it's. I mean, it's there doesn't seem to be any concern about that. Like within the Democratic Party, are constant debates over, are these activists getting too much authority? Is the party giving them what they want too much? And nothing like that really happens in the Republican Party, right?
Not real, no, because like I said before, that I think Trump gave every license to move farther right and to be more vocal about being farther right, and
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of these websites have very much done the same and taken advantage of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think also that there is kind of a fundamental confusion in the United States over what conservative means. That there's a conservative just in the generic sense that most people think of it as. Conservative means somebody who just wants to keep things the way that they are and
Mhm.
doesn't want to change things. But that's not what these people want. They want to have all kinds of lots of change, and to roll back things, and that's why they are better called reactionaries rather than conservatives.
Right.
Um, and but it's, I don't know, it's like there's a lot of people who seem to have misunderstood that. Do you think so?
I think so, because there was no real kind of set definition of being a conservative, versus being right. There's no real dividing line between them anymore, if there ever was. And you can kind of see how what were normally steadfast conservative organizations becoming moving farther right, like the Heritage Foundation. They definitely moved right, and they have this. Speaking of radically changing things up, that's I'm sure,
Hmm.
sure you've heard their program called the Project 2025, which is which they plan to implement if Trump gets reelected, and it's basically a dismantling of the civil service system to install political operatives in civil service jobs to try and get their agendas implemented.
Hmm. Well, and then another area where that's happened also has been um, the promotion of conspiracy mongers like Robert Kennedy, Jr. That he was, again, somebody who. So these people had always existed around the kind of the Alex Jones tier of Republican media, but now, at least until he ran as an independent, while he was running as a Democrat, he was regularly put on Fox News, and and his anti-vaccine views have become mainstream in Republican politics, whereas before Republicans in the polls were just as pro-vaccine as Democrats were.
Right.
Back in the day. Is that, I mean, is it, much of that do you think is people going where they think the market is, or how much of that do you think have they said is that they've been convinced? have they even talked about it at all?
I think a lot of the right-wing promotion of RFK Jr. involved the idea that he could be popular, that might hurt Biden's reelection. And that was more of a straight thing that Newsmax did. Roland Illy always embraced anti-vaxxer stuff. So they embraced RFK's anti-vaxxer stuff. And the Media Research Center promoted him as well. But they like to frame him as being a victim of so-called censorship on social media, which is a lot of which involved debunking his false claims and conspiracy theories about vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
But after he switched to running as independent, they all pretty much stopped promoting him.
Yeah, pretty. Yeah, it's like that illustrates something though that so in my own former days as in right-wing media, we all thought that well, I guess I didn't as much think this, but my colleagues all thought that the mainstream press was just out there to flagrantly serve Democrats and do whatever they said. But the almost immediate cancellation of Bobby Kennedy Jr. Really kind of gives lie to that. Um, eventually, and part of my exit from the right was understanding that as much as they complained about liberal media bias, quote unquote, the stuff that they wanted to make was so much more biased and much more partisan, much less factual, and they seem to have no concern about that. That what they were doing was much worse and much more biased.
Right, and they really don't care about journalism per se. It's more about activism. They think,
Mhm.
like I said, they think that the non-right-wing media are just a bunch of liberal activists, where it's more of a geographical bias because most of them are based in New York and DC, so you get more out of that.
Well, and I mean, but again, some of it also just simply is that if you're interested in facts, and that's what journalism is supposed to be interested in,
Yeah,
and whether that succeeds or not, is perhaps another thing. But if you're interested in saying, well, so and so said this or did that, that's not what right-wing media is about. And we're seeing that more recently with all these allegations about Joe Biden, having supposedly been involved in business with his son Hunter Biden, and all these completely unfounded allegations about large-scale voter fraud and stealing of elections in 2020. They haven't had evidence for any of these things.
right.
And so if you're interested in facts, that makes you an enemy to them, it seems like.
Right. Yeah. I mean, all they're doing is just doing stenography for James Comer. They're not independently investigating anything he says. And I mean, you see
Hmm.
that on the MRC all the time, where it's like networks censor the latest allegations made by James Comer. It's like and they don't
Hmm.
explore the accuracy of what they are, and uh, and that's really what right wing media is about. Not necessarily about trying to do a sort of journalism that kind of promotes conservatism, but also holds it to account. It's just straight up activism.
Yeah. Well, and there was a moment um that, and I'm trying to, I think this was in 2012, when Tucker Carlson had first started the Daily Caller, or maybe 2014, and he had given a speech to the CPAC conference in which he said that he believed that the New York Times did good journalism, even though that it was biased in what it covered, but that it was sound on the facts, and that if they said something happened, then it did happen, and that his goal with the caller was to basically duplicate their reliability, but have it be more right wing. And people booed him
Yeah,
for saying that.
yeah, people
Um, yeah, go ahead.
don't like it when they. 'Cause I think there's like long ago, I can't remember, it was like the early 2000s or something, when
Hmm.
Tim Graham of the Media Research was actually quoted as saying that 75, something like 75% of what's in regular media is fine. There's nothing wrong with it.
Hmm.
But he uses but that's not the impression you get from reading any of their websites. That's all
Hmm.
about just attacking the media and
Hmm.
not giving them any credit for anything unless they're advancing a right wing narrative.
Hmm. Well, and I guess, another kind of thing that has been problematic, and you talked about a little bit with some of these activists that WorldNet Daily had
Mhm.
been involved with, who were publishing, racist material. But one person in particular who was much worse than the people you just mentioned was this guy named Paul Nayland. Um,
Yes.
and he had published a book. WorldNet Daily had published, I guess, it was at least one book by him, or had they done two? They did a film with him. That's right. So, do you want to talk about who Paul Nayland was, and kind of? There's been several characters that had been fully integrated in legacy right wing media, who would then also had subsequent private careers and later public ones as full scale racist activists.
Right. Yeah. Paul Lynn was a politician, I think, in Wisconsin. Is that right? But
I think so. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, he came up.
He ran against Paul Ryan. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He was like around to the right of Paul Ryan, and he got a lot of attention for that. So, and I think that's what gave Roland Daly the idea to publish a book by him because he was kind of a rising star on the right. After the book came out, however, he started getting more racist and anti-Semitic, and
And what was his book? What was that?
oh,
It was about the. Was it about the run against Paul Ryan?
I think a lot of it is just like in giving a platform to his right wing views.
Okay. Yeah, and one of them was he had some sort of documentary that was anti-Muslim, if I remember right.
Right. And I think I can't remember if Roland Day was involved in that, but they
Or
downplayed
that
it.
they promoted it, yeah.
Yeah.
Or well, actually, hold on. No, I pulled it up here. You said that they started selling on its online store
Okay. Yeah.
his film. Yeah. So, um, and then yeah, so he began getting more radicalized, and eventually began appearing on so-called alt-right activist podcasts, and explicitly spouting um, racist propaganda, and
And
um,
that's a lot of anti-Semitic stuff too. And
as well. Yeah, yeah. But what's very troubling though is that and after that all got exposed about his racism, he did actually kind of get dropped from legacy right wing media in 2018. But now here we are in 2023. A lot of that rhetoric is now kind of mainstream in the Republican Party, especially in regards to this conspiracy theory about how that they really believe that the goal of the Democratic Party is to replace white people in the United States
right.
with immigrants. And that seems like that's something that is a regular remark now on Fox News, and
Yeah.
things you hear in presidential debates even now,
Mhm.
unfortunately, including by people who are not even white. Uh,
Right. Yeah. And and they try to pass it off by false equivalence by noting that liberals have pointed out the Democratic shift, but pointing out the Democratic shift is not the same as accusing Democrats of engineering the democratic shift to
Demographic, you mean?
to achieve that.
Well, it is also the case as well, though, that younger white Americans are less interested in Republicans as well, and so like and I'll say, like, for me, when I was a right-wing activist, I was not religious, and so I was an anomaly in that regard, and I was very needless to say, I was not a Christian nationalist, but that definitely made some people very suspicious of me. And when I first got into, so I moved to DC to work in right wing media and created one of the sites that you monitored for a while, Newsbusters. That somebody told me I should not put on my Facebook profile that I was agnostic atheist, as I described myself. They said some people are going to hate you because of that. And I thought that I thought there might be some truth to that, but I thought that, well, if they did, then I wouldn't want to work with them anyway. So who cares?
Yeah.
But in retrospect, that person was certainly correct.
Yeah.
Because Christian supremacism and Christian nationalism is so important to right wing media, and that they don't. But even a lot of these organizations, they don't say that that's what they want. But in fact, it is what they want. Like they don't say it too often. Maybe they'll say it once in a while. But generally speaking, they're not out there proclaiming we want far right Christians to have more rights than everybody else. They don't say that too often. Why do you suppose they never get asked about those opinions, though?
They probably I think a lot of it they kind of just put out like isolated views about that, and they don't explain that it's a Christian nationalist view. That way they can kind of get it out there for the people who know, and kind of get the, while also being able to kind of, I don't know whether plausible denial or not, but we can say that just trying to get a view out that the right people will know what it means. To everybody else is somewhat innocuous.
Yeah, well, and it's there's also just this sense that they really do believe that America was created to be a Christian country. And even though it's something that I think a lot of people who don't really consume a lot of right wing media, that they don't understand that the whole ecosystem is built on just myth after myth after lie after myth, and eventually it really is impossible to get people to understand, for somebody, again, like for me, when I was on the right, that I remember I had a conversation with Jim Hoff, the creator of Gateway Pundit, who has had to retract many stories over the years that he got wrong, including being sued multiple times for accusing people of being murderers.
Yes.
Mass shooters and whatnot. I said to him, well, why aren't you more careful about your stories and more careful about being accurate? I feel like it's not helping conservatives. It would be more helpful if you did. And he said, well, people just want to have fun. That's what he said to me. And so in that moment, it did make me think, well, this, for him, a lot of what he says, he may not believe it. But at the same time, you really, I couldn't really know whether, when I would tell people this thing, this story you want to run is not true, or this thing you told me about is false. And they would never say, oh, okay, well, it never gave them any sort of larger concern when I would tell them things they believed were so true were completely not. they'd just say, okay, well, we won't do it then. And eventually people started telling me they thought I was negative because I was constantly shooting down their stories. They were like, well, what do you want to run a story about?
Mm,
And I was like, well, why don't we just do some policy analysis? And those. So I worked at the Examiner as an editor at one point, and I tried to get people to they have this belief, among other things, that tax cuts always increase revenue. And I said to them, okay, well, show me evidence of that being true. And nobody could
mm,
ever show me evidence of that. And so I would say, okay, so then why do we say that if we don't have evidence for it? And so they just at that, eventually just decide, okay, well, we won't say that anymore. But we won't examine the larger question of why did we believe this thing without having any evidence for it. And I'll say, for people who are watching or listening, it is a little bit surreal in that you, Terry, are the first person I have ever had on this show who I have had previously blocked on Twitter. um, so, and I guess it's probably a little weird for you as well, right?
well, like, I think I wrote some not so nice things about you back in the day on my website. So
Hmm.
always pointing out where I thought you were wrong. And
Sure. Yeah.
but yeah, I do kind of agree with you. There's like right wing media tends to be more about owning the libs rather than getting things right.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I mean, so for people who might say though that these sites like WorldNet Daily or Newsmax or I mean, CNS News doesn't even exist anymore. Actually, yeah, let's talk about that. What was CNS News, and what happened to
Yeah,
it?
CNS News was the quote quote news division of the Media Research Center, and had
Hmm.
run for a long time. Had like a actual longtime journalist there who actually tried to occasionally did real journalism, but a lot of it is just like repeating right wing narratives. And
Hmm.
in April of this year, like 3 months before its 25th anniversary, the MRC abruptly shut down CNS without explanation. They didn't
Hmm.
give anybody a chance to say goodbye. They never publicly explained why they did it. They got rid of like a bunch of people who had been there for 15, 20 years or more.
Hmm.
And and the funny thing is, I think I'm the only person who noticed that or wrote anything about it, which kind of tells you the its its placement in the right wing media sphere in recent years. That it kind
Hmm.
of, yeah, it kind of became, I think, I think it was like an early attempt to kind of do legitimate conservative journalism, but I think
Well, I think
conservative,
yeah, they didn't want it. I mean, that's ultimately what it showed, I think.
yeah,
Um,
and they're kind of caught betwixt and between that they're they weren't putting out enough good stuff that got noticed, but they weren't extreme enough to get that other kind of notice.
mhm. Yeah, and it's something kind of similar did also happen. You mentioned the Heritage Foundation earlier. The Heritage Foundation, they had started a website called Daily Signal, and in the beginning, they were trying to do kind of similar things to CNS, do lots of reporting and policy analysis, policy based reporting, we'll say. But then eventually, I mean, I guess I'm not going to say when this change happened, but I did notice over time that all the reporting stopped, and that everything was an opinion column. Almost everything was an opinion column, and because it's like that again, like that's what the audience want. They're not interested in sort of a dispassionate presentation of facts. They want to know what should I think about this stuff? And who are the bad guys in this?
And how exactly are liberals the bad guys in this particular situation? Because
Yeah.
they always are.
Yeah, and I at one point it did remind me of something that I had personally experienced. So that I had given I used to teach occasional classes for this group called the Leadership Institute, which is a training organization on the right. For those who don't know, and the classes I was teaching were about how to start a website and whatnot, and I tried to make my presentations as strictly factual as possible and not try to get bogged down into various controversies or whatnot, um and because I assumed people were there to just kind of learn, what should I do, how do I do this, the nuts and bolts. And but oftentimes I was asked afterward in the Q and A's about questions. They would ask me, instead of saying, well, what software should I use, or how does search engine optimize or whatever, just
Mhm.
more practical questions. Instead, I was often asked, well, tell me what you think of Obama, and or what do you think about some random politician, Republican? And I would say, well, I'm not really here to talk about that. I mean, or they'd ask me, well, tell me, what do you think about the Constitution? And I would, and it was just dumbfound me. And I would say, well, I'm not here to talk about those things. I'm just here to tell you how to do something. And the response that I got sometimes back was that, well, I want to know where you stand. I want to know what you think about the bigger picture. And I would say, well, you can talk to me after we're done here if you really want to know, but I don't know if you do. uh, um, and so, or actually, I remember getting asked if I was a registered Republican. People asked me that as well. And actually, at that time, I was not. I never had registered as a Republican, believe it or not.
Hmm.
And I guess maybe that was another thing that made me suspect.
Yeah,
Perhaps.
you'd think that no, the fact that you're given a presentation at the Leadership Institute would be evidence enough that you have at least some sympathy toward conservatism.
Hmm. But yeah, no, they wanted to hear it explicitly from me. Um, so yeah. But yeah, I mean, there were a number of little incidents like that that definitely made me concerned over time. And I guess now we haven't talked about Newsmax as much in the conversation here. So Newsmax, I guess they are kind of the exception to the rule here of these legacy right wing media outfits getting bigger, instead of contracting over time. So
Right.
they started very small and have continued to grow, and now they have a channel that routinely has Donald Trump and other top Republicans on their Fox News rival channel. So how is it that they've been able to grow, and these other ones have not? What do you think?
They did a lot of diversifying fairly early. They got into the health space where they did like a lot of newsletters, like a lot of sketchy health newsletters, but it
Hmm.
made generated revenue, and they're able to kind of parlay that and create originally just video content, and they ultimately an entire channel.
Hmm.
And they kind of did a good job capitalizing on Fox News's stumbles, if you can call it that, in that area where they kind of backed away from Trump and got caught.
Actually started telling the truth for
Yeah, right, which is
in 2020.
AKA backed away from Trump.
Yeah.
But
Well, so you think it was just the diversification that they were able to do that?
yeah, because the World of Daily tried that as well, but they didn't succeed very well at all. Um, first they
Hmm.
got into books. They partnered with a bunch of different companies for creating their own book publishing entity. Um, Though actually, what they did end up doing, they acquire their final book partner called World Ahead Press, which was actually run by a created by a co-founder of PayPal.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that.
Yes, and of course we know who else came from PayPal: Elon Musk and Peter Thiel.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yep.
they also tried to do like a film division too as well, and they tried to parlay that into something, and they started having money problems for things that got shut down were the book division and the movie division because they
Mm-hmm.
clearly weren't generating enough money to justify their existence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I guess one other kind of little side note about WorldNet Daily is that Joseph Farah, the founder and owner, his daughter Alyssa Farah went into Republican politics as well,
Right,
and
and
then eventually
she,
worked for Donald Trump.
right,
Um,
she worked in the Trump White House, and the interesting thing on that is that when that first happened, they didn't really publicize it on Rolla Daily, and they actually kind of wiped out her. She had written some articles for Rolla Daily while she was in college. She
mhm,
went to, I think she went to Patrick Henry College, the home the homeschooling family school outside of DC.
mhm.
They kind of basically wiped out her archive. The stories are still there, but they don't have her name on them. And
Okay.
and after she moved, away from Trump after the Capitol riot, that kind of caused a family rift.
Well, she actually left before that. She quit for Trump because he was concerned
I think
that
she
he
left
was
like
lying about
before
the
the
election.
riot, but she started being vocal about it afterwards, and
Yeah.
that caused issues in the family with Joseph. And
Yeah. Well,
the
and in her experience, I think, and parallels mine in that, if you want to have any sort of connection to facts, um, and exist in right wing ecosystem, either you have to sort of bury that impulse in yourself,
right,
and become kind of sociopathic, or you leave. Or you go nuts. There's really only three sort of things that happen, and and I do think that that's part of why you do have seen some people get more radicalized, because that, again, like with Trump, they were so insistent that he was horrible and just the worst person ever to run for president, and couldn't be allowed in the White House. He'd be a disaster. And then when you say that type of language, and then you turn on a dime
right.
because it's good for your revenue and good for your career, that's got to do something to your brain, I have to feel like.
I would think so. And you'd think that it would make you feel like a sellout, and people would notice that too, and they just kind of brush it off.
Well,
Um,
even, yeah, and the mainstream media really, unfortunately, has done a very poor job at that, I feel like. And they just keep doing this over and over with these people that, whether it's they let them pretend, they never have them have a real discussion about
mm,
the 2020 election. And so, and all of them, including Trump, knew that there was no evidence of voter fraud, except
right,
for the most deranged, crazy people. Almost every Republican activist or commentator knows that Trump, that he lost, because there wasn't a single poll that showed he was going to win. Not one.
yeah,
Not one poll said he was going to win. So the idea that he didn't, well, shouldn't, everybody knows. And everybody knows how much people hate the guy, that he's the first president in American history for the majority of his term, almost the entirety of his term had a negative approval rating.
right,
And so, of course, that person lost his reelection bid. It was
right.
no surprise to anyone. But again, this was just another example that, well, they decided, well, he's going to try to go for it, so we'll let him do it. And there was some anonymous, I think it was a Republican congressional source that was quoted to the Washington Post. They said something like, "Well, what harm could he do? We'll just let him try this for a while, and then we'll be done with him, and he'll be out of our hair." And of course, that was
Yeah.
wrong.
And they kind of continue to feed on that as well, because the MRC after the 2020 election kind of built this kind of parallel conspiracy theory that Trump lost because not enough people knew about Hunter Biden's laptop. But they hired polls. They It's based on a couple polls that they paid for. One was from the McLaughlin Group, which was Trump's election pollster, and the other one was from the polling company, which is, of course, was founded by Kellyanne Conway, who was a Trump
Mm,
advisor. So the polls
bias.
could be attacked as suspect, and then of course they've been citing that ever since, and they've been
Mhm.
other people picked up on it as well. Um,
Yeah, yeah, and it's also, and that those polls were a good example of why self-reporting is actually not used very much in political science, because in many ways people will agree to any proposition, and they may not understand
yeah,
fully what it means when they agree to it. And that includes when you ask people what their political ideology is, that many people will say one thing but actually have beliefs that are diametrically opposed to
mhm,
that ideology, but in their mind that's what whatever the word means to them, and so they'll tell you that. And many people have, and there are countless videos out there on the internet of people going to public spaces and saying, are you glad about Trump's pro-choice policies? Do you support those? Oh,
mm,
yes, I do. Or do you support, Joe Biden's standing up for oil companies, or whatever, like the opposite view? They will ask people,
right,
and they'll say yes, yes, they like it. So those types of surveys are basically worthless from a polling standpoint, as a matter of
right.
fact.
No, and even today, the MRC is effectively claiming that the only reason Trump is ahead because the media wants him to win the nomination. It's like you know who
Hmm.
else wants to win? Most Republicans, but you never criticize that, do you? And
Hmm.
that's
Well, they also said that in 2015, when they
yeah,
hated Trump. The media promoted Trump because they wanted Trump to become the Republican nominee
yeah,
instead of Ted Cruz. So it was, I mean, it's like literally completely contradictory, nonsensical viewpoints, that they
right,
couldn't, it was just impossible for them to grasp that some of these people, like Jeff Zucker of CNN, just thought that he was a ridiculous show and
mhm,
wanted to let people see that. And like that seems a much more obvious, and as it turns out, supported by the facts,
yeah,
of what happened. That's why he did it.
yeah, and yeah. Having worked in newspapers for a good chunk of my career, we're not that smart. We don't plan that far ahead. We have to, we're covering what's going on, and we don't generally don't try to build a narrative about somebody unless we're just a lot of us just chasing what's out there and seeing what people are doing and reporting that.
Mhm.
So I'm always
Well,
like,
yeah, and especially in Trump in 2015, it was such an incredible novelty. It was
yeah,
like it was like a Hollywood movie. It was almost
mhm,
like Brewster's Millions,
yeah,
the Richard Pryor movie, where a guy running for president kind of as a joke, uh, and that was how a lot of political, editors and reporters and executive producers. That's how they saw the Trump
yeah.
2016
It's just mainly like a
presidential.
vanity run, basically. And
Yeah.
even he was even like, well, Newsmax kind of floated him as a candidate as early as 2012 because Ron Kessler who was a big buddy of Trump and actually had written a book several years ago about
Hmm.
the I guess the Palm Beach scene. social scene and actually heavily praised Trump in the book and while mocking everybody else. He was really
Mhm.
heavily floating Trump as a candidate back then. And I think that kind of helped set the stage, kind of gave him a foothold into being a candidate in 2016.
Mhm. Well, and Roger Ailes certainly was helpful as well, and
Right.
because he gave Trump a weekly slot on Fox and Friends to just
Right.
talk. I mean, and
Yeah.
I remember when that happened at the time, it was just so random and stupid. Like that was how most people saw
Yeah,
it.
he just calls in the Fox and Friends and just rants for a while. It's like,
About literally anything.
yes.
And usually nothing.
Right. And of course, we're all kind of amazing. How did that happen? How did that turn into him becoming a credible candidate? So
Mhm,
amazing to kind of watch that.
mhm, in retrospect.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you know what? It is interesting, and I've had some other episodes of this show where we've talked about it that, um, you know, the as the right-wing media ecosystem has expanded so drastically and so immensely, whether it's people like Andrew Tate or Joe Rogan or Elon Musk now, who just absolutely dwarf anything of these more DC focused people that you look at.
Yeah.
That the Democratic powers that be, the liberal philanthropists, I don't think that they've noticed that this happened. I don't think that they realize how popular Joe Rogan is, and they don't understand how many people watch Matt Walsh. They have no idea that this has happened, and that people so that such and their audiences are so huge now, and predominantly this is because of video. Um, that their audiences are bigger than the Washington Post editorial page. They're bigger than the Atlantic. They're bigger than the New Republic. They're bigger than pretty much any prestigious left organization.
Right.
um, and on YouTube, before he got banned from there, Alex Jones had more views on YouTube than CNN did, even.
Mhm.
That's how huge this is. And I don't think that a lot of people especially in the more established left, I don't think they take this seriously. Do you think so?
Probably not. I don't think anybody took Matt Walsh seriously until like the Bud Light controversy, and then the controversy with Target over the LGBT goods they were selling. I mean, they actually made a couple falsehoods about what they were selling, and that got corrected
Mhm.
in actual media outlets. But right wing media, they didn't care. They just promoted the outrage.
Mhm. Yeah, but at the same time, I don't feel like that people uh, in the establishment left, they don't know about this stuff. They don't care about it. They think that everybody's just as influential as Joe Farah. And they don't that the dynamic has changed in
Yeah,
probably the past 10 years.
definitely. Yeah, Will and Daly does not really have anywhere near the influence they once did. Um, I think the media research centers kind of, I'm not sure where they're at because they seem to be kind of,
Are they falling quite a bit? Yeah.
yeah, they're
um
shrinking a bit as far as
well,
they
CNS, yeah, as an example,
killed
yeah.
CNS. I think they've had some
And they
other,
had to get rid of their culture and media institute. That doesn't exist anymore.
yeah, that doesn't exist
uh,
anymore. Um, per se, MRC Latino really doesn't exist anymore, though they have Jorge
yeah.
Bonilla back writing for them, but mainly
Hmm.
as like a regular writer and not necessarily Latino only.
Project. Yeah. Yeah, but and so my point being though that as these new far right figures have come along, it's I don't think that the establishment left doesn't take them seriously either, even though their audiences are so much bigger. You know,
Right.
and part of it might be that they know Rogan by his former reputation of being, you know, a guy who makes people eat bugs.
Yeah.
um, and that's what they want to see him as, instead of being the number one by far right-wing media personality, who is a kingmaker for them. I
Mhm.
mean, he has single-handedly created multiple far right media figures at this point.
Right. And I kind of see it from the viewpoint of they should be taken seriously if other right wing figures are defending them anytime they do something wrong.
Hmm. Which they
Because
certainly do.
you never see went hard in defending Rogan a couple of years ago when he got caught giving
Being racist, yeah.
or being racist and promoting like a lot of anti-vax conspiracies, and
Hmm.
then getting like having YouTube and all that kind of pull those videos because they were false
False.
conspiracies.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and yeah, so I don't think they take it seriously, and they don't understand the audience reach, and
Right.
you know, and some of it is to go way back to earlier in the conversation that, you know, you said that when the more conventional newspaper people that you knew early in the days of your site, that they just thought that this stuff would go away. And like I had a conversation with somebody who is a very well known funder of center left causes, and this person said to me, "Oh, that stuff's not serious." Um, and I said, "Well, what if millions, tens of millions of people believe it? Is it serious then?" And he didn't respond.
Yeah.
Because yeah, they don't again, like, I can understand, you know, when you look at somebody like Walsh, you know, or Shapiro. I mean, these people are idiots. They're stupid. They run their mouth and say whatever it will get them traffic and outrage, and the things they say are unsupported and ridiculous. They are, but they're still massively influential. Um, and you know, there's this, I don't know, there's this, I feel like there is a kind of a myopia of people who live in what liberal bloggers called the reality-based community, in
Mhm.
the early 2000s. The people who live in the reality-based community, they think everybody else does too, um, and that's very unrealistic, I would say.
Right. And I think that kind of came to the fore more after the 2020 election when people still believe there was election fraud, even though nothing has ever been proven.
Including what was it, 75 court cases.
Right.
Nothing came out in 75 court cases. That should probably tell you something.
But even today, Rudy Giuliani is going to be on
Hmm.
trial for the false things he said about the two Georgia election workers. And
Yeah.
even though he had admitted in court that they were false, so that they could just get it out and they didn't have to do discovery, he came out yesterday and said they're true. I can prove it. It's like, why didn't you do that during discovery if you're going to do that? So it's like
Hmm.
they kind of believe their own.
Choose your own reality.
Yeah, they get high
uh,
on their own supply.
yeah. Well, and it's, yeah, and the Trump 2020 election lies have shown that there are real consequences to believing lies like this, and
Yeah.
you know, and even with the economy, that when you look at public opinion surveys of consumer confidence, the right wing media's constant drumbeat of how the economy is horrible and Biden is leading us all into a depression with fentanyl and, you know, illegal immigrants and trans people. Uh, the Republicans have basically sort of brainwashed their supporters so much that within literally a week of Biden becoming president, when they asked people about asked Republicans, what do you think about the economy? They went from thinking it was fantastic, even during the worst of the pandemic, to thinking it was horrible. It was never getting better. It was, you know, And those viewpoints are now indirectly impacting many other people as well, who may have never even heard or watched right-wing media even once. It still has an impact.
Yeah. Um, I think they try to use the framing that because there was inflation, the prices are still high, the economy is horrible, and we're all going to die or whatever. And that's not really the reality. And they don't have no interest into delving further into it because attacking Biden is the point of highlighting these.
Of saying anything, literally.
Yeah,
But certainly
highlighting
talking
only
about
the bad things
inflation.
and ignoring the good things. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and as a matter of talking about inflation, I mean, the inflation rate in this country was significantly lower than pretty much any other industrialized country in the world. So it has nothing to, this is a global condition that we're dealing with here. It has nothing to do with Biden per se,
Right.
uh, because presidents just don't have that kind of power, no matter who they are.
Hmm.
But you can't say that. Yeah. So, all right. Well, so what other have you got any other things that you think we should talk about here before as we wrap up here?
I think we've kind of covered everything I want to get to do. So I think we're in good shape.
Okay. Well, so yeah, for people who do want to keep up with you, what's your preferred ways that they do that?
Okay. Website is conwebwatch.com. There is an attached blog. I'm on Curlin, Twitter/X. I'm also on Mastodon, Post, and Blue Sky under Conweb Watch on all of those.
Okay, great. All right. Well, thanks for being here, Terry, and
Thanks
we'll
for having me.
let people do that. All right. Great. See you next
Bye.
time or later. Bye.